On the night of December 16, 1773, roughly 100 men walked down to Griffin's Wharf in Boston Harbor and destroyed 342 chests of East India Company tea. The cargo was worth about 9,659 pounds, roughly $1.7 million in today's money. They dumped every ounce of it into the salt water. And here's the detail that tells you everything about Boston. Nobody stole any. One man was caught stuffing leaves into his coat lining, and the others stripped him and sent him home through the streets. They swept the ship's decks clean afterward. They replaced a padlock they'd broken, the personal property of one of the captains. This was not a riot. This was a city making a calculated, almost surgical point. We will destroy our own wealth before we accept terms we didn't agree to. That instinct, the willingness to tear down what you have in order to become something else, is the story of Boston. Not just that December night, but for 4 centuries running. The city leveled its own hills and filled its own harbors. It demolished its own neighborhoods. It cut a highway through its own heart, then spent a generation and $24 billion ripping that highway back out. No American city has been so thoroughly, so relentlessly, so expensively remade. And no American city has paid a higher price for its own restlessness. The place called Boston today sits on land that largely did not exist when the city was founded. That's not a metaphor. More than 5,000 acres of modern Boston is landfill, built from the tops of hills that were cut down and the rubble of buildings that burned. The original Peninsula, where John Winthrop and his Puritan colonists landed in 1630, was roughly 789 acres of land connected to the mainland by a strip of ground so narrow that high tide sometimes swallowed it. 3 hills rose from the peninsula. Tri-Mountain, they called it, later shortened to Tremont. Beacon Hill, the tallest, stood about 60 feet higher than it does now. The settlers chose the place because it was defensible. Water on 3 sides, 1 road in. Winthrop, aboard the ship Arbella during the crossing, had called the settlement a city upon a hill, a phrase from the Gospel of Matthew, meaning a moral example to the watching world. The irony would take centuries to fully unfold, but here's the beginning of it. They would cut that hill down. They'd haul its earth away in carts and dump it into the harbor to make new land. Boston couldn't even leave its own founding metaphor alone. The reshaping began early and never stopped. Between 1807 and 1829, workers cut down the tops of Beacon Hill and Copp's Hill and used the gravel to fill in the Mill Pond, a 50-acre tidal basin that had powered grain mills since the colonial era. They used shovels, pickaxes, and horse-drawn wagons. 21 years to fill 50 acres. Then, in the 1830s, the owners of the wharves along the South Cove, including Griffin's Wharf, the very spot where the tea had been destroyed, decided that filling in the cove and building railroad terminals would be more profitable than keeping it open for ships. The Tea Party's stage set, paved over for commerce. And then came the most audacious project of all. The Back Bay was exactly what the name suggests. A shallow tidal basin west of the peninsula, roughly 700 acres of mudflats that stank at low tide and flooded at high. A dam built across it in 1814 to harness tidal power had made things worse. It trapped sewage, and the bay became, in one contemporary description, a place bubbling like a cauldron with the noxious gases that are exploding from the corrupting mass below. By the 1850s, the city had had enough. Starting in 1857, a special railroad line hauled gravel from quarries in Needham, 9 miles away. A 35-car train arrived every 45 minutes, day and night, for years. When the Needham gravel ran out, they brought fill from Canton, Dedham, and Hyde Park. When the Great Fire of 1872 destroyed 65 acres of downtown, they dumped the rubble into the Back Bay, too. By 1882, the project was complete. Boston had manufactured an entirely new neighborhood, its most fashionable, with arrow-straight streets, brownstone townhouses, and a boulevard modeled on the Champs-Élysées. Commonwealth Avenue, today among the most expensive addresses in the city, runs on top of ground that didn't exist when the Constitution was signed. This tells you something about Boston's character that no amount of biography can. The city didn't just build on its geography, it replaced its geography. It treated the physical world as a first draft. And that habit of mind, the conviction that what exists is merely raw material for what should exist, shows up in everything Boston did for the next 200 years, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes catastrophically. But before the catastrophes, there was a golden age, and it lasted longer than most. Boston in the decades after the Revolution was not yet the largest city in America. New York had already claimed that. But it was arguably the most influential. It had earned that influence the hard way. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, British soldiers had fired into a crowd outside the Custom House on King Street, killing 5 men, the first blood of the Revolution, though nobody called it that yet. A silversmith named Paul Revere made an engraving of the scene that was part journalism, part propaganda, and entirely effective. 3 years later came the tea. 2 years after that, on the night of April 18, 1775, Revere rode to Lexington to warn that the regulars were coming. The battles of Lexington and Concord the next morning started the war. 2 months later, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, actually fought on Breed's Hill across the harbor in Charlestown, the British took the position but lost over 1,000 men doing it, and the Americans learned they could stand and fight. The British finally evacuated Boston on March 17, 1776, after George Washington fortified Dorchester Heights with cannons dragged 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga. It was the first major American victory of the war. The city that had started the Revolution was the first city freed by it. And the men who had financed the rebellion came out the other side with their fortunes intact. The merchant families, the Cabots and the Lowells and the Adamses and the Hancocks, had risked everything on independence, and independence had rewarded them. They didn't call themselves the Brahmins yet. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. wouldn't coin that term until 1860. But they already behaved like a ruling class, and they had the capital to back it up. Boston's wharves handled trade from the West Indies, from China, from the coast of Africa. State Street was America's financial center before Wall Street existed. Paul Revere, the midnight rider, had pivoted from silversmithing to manufacturing. His copper rolling mill in Canton supplied the sheathing for the hull of the USS Constitution, and his company provided the copper that covered the dome of the new Massachusetts State House on Beacon Hill, designed by the architect Charles Bulfinch and completed in 1798. That dome, still gleaming above the city today, was gilded in 23-carat gold leaf in 1874. And it sits on a hill that was once 60 feet taller before the Bostonians cut the top off. The Brahmins did something unusual with their money. They invested it not just in more money, but in institutions that would outlast them. In 1829, Boston opened the Tremont House, the first modern hotel in America. Designed by the 26-year-old architect Isaiah Rogers, built of Quincy granite, fronted by a Doric portico, the Tremont introduced indoor plumbing, running water, lockable guest rooms, bellboys, a reception area, and free soap. Innovations that became the template for every luxury hotel that followed. It cost guests $2 a night. Charles Dickens stayed there and marveled at its endless corridors. Davy Crockett passed through. At the opening night dinner, attended by Daniel Webster and Mayor Josiah Quincy, gentlemen feasted on roast beef, boiled cod, turkeys, pears, and grapes, and the price of admission was $1 per person. 26 years later, the Parker House opened directly across the street. the hotel that would become the oldest continuously operating hotel in America, the birthplace of Parker House rolls and Boston cream pie, the place where Charles Dickens would return in 1867 and perform A Christmas Carol for the Saturday Club before taking the public stage at the nearby Tremont Temple. The Tremont House, the grand original, was demolished in 1895 and replaced with an office building. Today, a Citizens Bank and parts of Suffolk University occupy the site. Meanwhile, the Brahmin's money was flowing outward into the countryside and transforming the entire region. Francis Cabot Lowell had traveled to England and memorized the workings of the power loom. Some said he smuggled plans back, others that his memory alone sufficed. And his Boston Manufacturing Company built the first integrated textile mill in Waltham. The profits were extraordinary. Boston Capital built the mill town of Lowell and then the mill town of Lawrence, employing tens of thousands of workers, first Yankee farm girls and then waves of Irish immigrants fleeing the famine. The money came home to State Street. The Brahmins invested it in railroads, in insurance companies, in more mills. By the 1850s, Boston's industrial families controlled an estimated 1/5 of all the cotton spindles in America. They weren't making things with their hands. They were financing the making of things, and the difference mattered. Boston was becoming a city of capital, not of labor. The workers were elsewhere. The money was on State Street. And then on the evening of November 9th, 1872, the fire department's horses were sick. An epizootic, an equine influenza, had swept through the Northeast that fall, weakening the horses that pulled Boston's heavy steam-powered fire engines. Chief Engineer John Damrell had already hired 500 extra men to pull the equipment by hand, and he'd been warning city officials for months that the downtown water mains were old and leaky, that the pressure was dangerously low, that the hydrant couplings weren't standardized. The officials told him not to magnify the needs of his department. At 7:20 p.m. on that Saturday, a fire broke out in the basement of a dry goods warehouse at 83 to 87 Summer Street. The fire alarm boxes were kept locked to prevent false alarms. Only certain key holders could open them, and 20 minutes passed before anyone could sound the alert. By the time the first engine company arrived, the building was fully engulfed. The flames jumped to the wooden mansard roofs that were fashionable in the district and leapt across the narrow streets. Gas lines exploded. Street lights popped. The water pressure was so low that firefighters couldn't get streams to the upper floors. Against Damrell's orders, city officials authorized men to blow up buildings with gunpowder, hoping to create fire breaks. The explosions only fanned the flames. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. watched the glow from Beacon Hill and wrote a poem about it. Alexander Graham Bell submitted an eyewitness account to the Boston Globe. The editors rejected it. Sailors reported seeing the light from the coast of Maine. By midday on November 10th, the fire was contained. It had consumed 65 acres of the city's finest commercial district, 776 buildings, of which 709 were supposedly fireproof brick, granite, or stone. The damage was $73.5 million, roughly $2 billion today. At least 30 people were dead, including 12 firefighters. 20,000 people lost their jobs. Nearly 1,000 businesses were gone. And the rubble, tons and tons of it, was hauled to the waterfront and dumped into the harbor to extend Atlantic Avenue. Even Boston's catastrophes became landfill. The city rebuilt with remarkable speed. Because most buildings had been heavily insured, overinsured in many cases, businesses had the cash to start construction within months. The fire bankrupted several insurance companies, but enriched the district itself. A 2017 study in the American Economic Review found that land values in the burned area actually rose after reconstruction because the forced rebuilding brought wider streets, larger parcels, and modern structures to a district that had been cramped and outdated. The fire was devastating. The rebuilding was profitable. Boston, as usual, turned destruction into opportunity. And then the money began doing something extraordinary. The Boston Public Library had opened in 1848, the first large, free municipal public library in the United States, an act of civic generosity that no other major American city had attempted. The Atlantic Monthly was founded in 1857. The Museum of Fine Arts opened in 1876. Henry Lee Higginson, a banker and Civil War veteran, founded the Boston Symphony Orchestra in 1881. He personally covered the deficit for decades. Trinity Church, designed by Henry Hobson Richardson in the Romanesque style, was consecrated in 1877 on the brand-new landfill of Copley Square, its foundations sunk into 40-foot wooden pilings because there was no bedrock beneath the filled-in bay. The Boston Public Library's grand McKim building rose across the square in 1895, designed by McKim, Mead, and White, with murals by John Singer Sargent and Pierre Puvis de Chavannes. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the Emerald Necklace, a chain of parks stretching from the Common to Franklin Park, 1,100 acres of green space, the most ambitious urban park system in the country. Boston in the late 19th century was not just wealthy, it was cultivated. The old Puritan earnestness had curdled into something more refined and more self-conscious, a city that believed its own mythology about being the Athens of America, the hub of the universe, the place Oliver Wendell Holmes meant when he wrote that the Lowells talked only to the Cabots, and the Cabots talked only to God. And then Boston did something genuinely ahead of its time. On the morning of September 1st, 1897, crowds gathered at the Public Garden to watch the first subway cars in North America emerge from a tunnel beneath Tremont Street. Boston had built America's first subway, a $5 million project paid for with city bonds, no state or federal money, constructed by cut-and-cover method right through the busiest streets in downtown. The Tremont Street subway ran 2.5 miles from the Public Garden to the northern edge of the city. In its first 11 months, it carried over 50 million passengers. Where 200 trolley cars an hour had crawled along the surface, the subway moved 282 cars an hour underground. It was a triumph of civic engineering, and portions of those original 1897 tunnels are still in use today, carrying Green Line trains beneath the same streets. But here is where the story shifts, because the Golden Age was already ending, and almost nobody noticed. The textile mills were moving south, chasing cheaper labor, lower taxes, and states without strong unions. New York had surpassed Boston as the nation's financial capital decades earlier. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, had connected New York's harbor to the Great Lakes and the interior, making it the indispensable port. Boston's harbor was fine, but it didn't lead anywhere except back to New England. The shipping trade consolidated around New York. The insurance industry followed. State Street's dominance eroded slowly, like the wooden pilings under the Back Bay brownstones when the water table dropped. Boston's population was still growing. It hit 560,000 by 1900, 748,000 by 1920, and would peak at about 801,000 in 1950. But the growth was increasingly driven by immigrants, not by new industry. The Irish had arrived in enormous numbers after the famine of the 1840s, and their children and grandchildren were growing up in a city whose power structure had no place for them. The Brahmins still controlled the banks, the insurance companies, the cultural institutions. They lived on Beacon Hill and in the Back Bay. They sent their sons to Harvard. They ran the economy. But they had lost something essential, the ballot box. Boston was becoming a majority Irish city governed by Yankee institutions, and the tension between those facts would define the next 50 years. James Michael Curley understood this better than anyone alive. Born in 1874 in Roxbury, the son of Irish immigrants from County Galway, Curley lost his father, a day laborer, when he was 10 years old. He left school after 9th grade. He learned to speak by attending night classes for 8 years at the Staley School of the Spoken Word, and studying the oratory of 19th century politicians. In 1904, he went to jail for 60 days for taking a civil service exam on behalf of a constituent who couldn't pass it himself. It should have ended his career. Instead, it made him. While sitting in a jail cell, Curley won election to the Board of Aldermen. His campaign slogan was, "He did it for a friend." Curley served 4 terms as mayor of Boston, 1914, 1922, 1930, and 1946, and dominated the city's politics for half a century. He called himself the mayor of the poor. His critics called him the rascal king. Both were right. He built schools and playgrounds and bathhouses in neighborhoods the Brahmins had never visited. He expanded Boston City Hospital. He cut the pay of the city's highest-paid workers and raised the pay of the lowest. He famously ordered long-handled mops for the scrub women at City Hall, declaring that no woman should go down on her knees except to pray to God. He also took kickbacks from every contractor who wanted a city job, used city funds to build himself a 21-room Georgian Revival mansion on the Jamaica Way with marble fireplaces and a 3-story spiral staircase, and was convicted twice, once for the civil service fraud, once for mail fraud during his final term as mayor, when he served 5 months in a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, while still technically holding office. President Truman commuted his sentence. The entire Massachusetts congressional delegation urged clemency, except for one man, Congressman John F. Kennedy, whose grandfather, John Honey Fitzgerald, had been driven from the 1914 mayoral race by Curley's threat to expose Fitzgerald's affair with a woman known as Toodles. Curley was Boston's rebellion turned inward. The city that had thrown off British rule now had a mayor who threw off Brahmin rule, not with tea and muskets, but with patronage and populism, and an electorate that loved him precisely because the people who ran the banks despised him. When Curley died in 1958, over 100,000 people filed past his coffin at the Hall of Flags in the Massachusetts State House. By then, the city he'd built his career on was already being taken apart. The demolition of the West End is one of the defining traumas of 20th century American urbanism, and it happened fast. The West End was a working-class neighborhood just north of Beacon Hill. 48 acres of narrow streets, brick tenements, corner bars, synagogues, Italian delis, a dense walking community of Jewish, Italian, Irish, and Polish families who had lived there for generations. Leonard Nimoy grew up there. In the 1950s, the Boston Housing Authority declared the neighborhood a slum and designated it for urban renewal under the Housing Act of 1949. Residents were told they'd have first preference in new housing. Studies claimed 63% of the dwelling units were substandard. But a later mayor, Ray Flynn, would describe the West End as a typical neighborhood and not blighted. Jane Jacobs' team of architects sent to document conditions had trouble finding anything bad enough to photograph. One of them told her the buildings were so well constructed they were superior to what would undoubtedly be erected in their place. On April 25, 1958, residents received eviction notices. The Boston Redevelopment Authority razed over 300 buildings across 46 acres. Somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 people were displaced, depending on the source. The neighborhood they'd known was erased, not partially, not selectively, but completely. In its place went 6 luxury high-rise apartment towers surrounded by parking lots and open space that bore no resemblance to what had been there. The former residents couldn't afford the new rents. Between a quarter and half of them ended up in housing worse than what they'd left. Researchers later found that approximately 40% of displaced West Enders suffered severe long-term grief reactions, the clinical language for losing a place that was also an identity. In 2015, 57 years later, the director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority formally apologized. The city stopped collecting garbage and cleaning the streets in the West End before the demolition, making the place look worse, making the case for destruction easier to photograph. That detail deserves to sit for a moment. And the West End wasn't the only neighborhood to go. Scollay Square, the old entertainment district, raucous and disreputable, the place where sailors went on shore leave, where burlesque theaters and tattoo parlors and cheap hotels clustered along narrow streets that had been there since before the Revolution, was demolished beginning in 1962. In its place went Government Center, a wind-swept brick plaza dominated by Boston City Hall, a brutalist concrete fortress designed by Coleman, McKinnell, and Knowles, which has been voted one of the ugliest buildings in the world in survey after survey. The city buried part of its 1897 subway tunnel, America's first, under the City Hall's foundations, filling in sections with concrete to support the weight. The New York Streets neighborhood, a small African-American community in the South End, was also razed for urban renewal. Entire blocks of the South End were cleared. Boston in the 1950s and 1960s was not rebuilding itself. It was dismantling itself. The same instinct that had once torn down hills and filled in harbors to make room for growth was now tearing down neighborhoods to make room for parking lots and concrete plazas and the promises of men in suits who said the future required a clean slate. The cruelest part is what survived by accident. Fenway Park, the home of the Red Sox, opened in 1912 and was nearly demolished several times, but kept surviving because nobody could agree on what to replace it with. The North End, which the highway would cut off from the rest of the city, was too tightly built and too fiercely defended by its Italian residents to be easily razed. Old North Church still stands. Paul Revere's house still stands. The things that endured in Boston endured largely because they were too stubborn or too beloved or too inconvenient to destroy, not because anyone had a plan to save them. And then came the highway. The Central Artery was an elevated expressway. Interstate 93, officially the John F. Fitzgerald Expressway, named for the very man Curley had driven from office. Built through the heart of downtown Boston between 1951 and 1959. It was supposed to carry 75,000 vehicles a day. Its chief champion, Commissioner of Public Works William Callahan, envisioned it as a modernizing stroke, separating downtown traffic from through traffic, bringing Boston into the automobile age. The project consumed buildings and blocks and sightlines. What it actually did was drop a 6-lane wall of steel and concrete between the city and its waterfront. The North End, the old Italian neighborhood, one of the most densely settled communities in the city, was severed from the harbor. The wharves, where merchant ships had docked for 3 centuries, sat in the shadow of an elevated highway, their cobblestones stained with highway runoff. The waterfront, which had been the reason for Boston's existence since 1630, the harbor that made the fortunes, launched the revolutions, received the immigrants, became a place people drove over but never walked to, an afterthought, a noise, a wall. By the early 1970s, the Central Artery was carrying nearly 200,000 vehicles a day, almost 3 times its designed capacity. Traffic crawled for 10 hours daily. The accident rate was 4 times the national average. The city that had built America's first subway now had one of America's worst traffic nightmares, and the highway that caused it was also the highway that had severed the city from its own origin story. And then in the fall of 1974, Boston's rebelliousness reached its ugliest expression. The city's public schools had been effectively segregated for decades, not by law as in the South, but by neighborhood boundaries, school assignments, and the deliberate choices of the Boston School Committee, which had resisted every attempt at integration. Black parents had been filing complaints since the 1960s. The state legislature had passed the Racial Imbalance Act in 1965, requiring desegregation, and the school committee had simply ignored it. On June 21, 1974, Federal Judge W. Arthur Garrity, Jr. ruled in Morgan v. Hennigan that the committee had intentionally maintained a segregated system, and he ordered a desegregation plan that included busing students between neighborhoods. On September 12, 1974, the first day of court-ordered busing, students were transported between South Boston and Roxbury, two neighborhoods separated by barely 2 miles and by an immense gulf of race, class, and mutual suspicion. The backlash was immediate and violent, concentrated in white working-class neighborhoods like South Boston and Charlestown, neighborhoods with deep roots, neighborhoods that had already watched the West End disappear, neighborhoods that felt targeted by decisions they hadn't been consulted about, neighborhoods where families had lived for 3 and 4 generations. Buses carrying black children to South Boston High School were pelted with rocks and bottles. Police lined the routes. Schools were surrounded by crowds screaming epithets. On April 5, 1976, a white teenager attacked a black man named Ted Landsmark outside City Hall, swinging an American flag at him like a lance. The photograph, taken by Stanley Forman, won the Pulitzer Prize and became one of the defining images of the era. It showed the flag, the symbol of the revolution Boston had started 2 centuries earlier, being used as a weapon against a fellow citizen on the plaza of the city that had invented American liberty. Boston's population dropped from its 1950 peak of about 801,000 to roughly 563,000 by 1980. White families left for the suburbs, Quincy, Braintree, Weymouth, taking the tax base with them. Downtown retailers closed or followed the customers to suburban malls. Jordan Marsh, the grand department store that had anchored Washington Street since 1851, shrank and faded. Filene's Basement, where generations of Bostonians had hunted for marked-down dresses and suits in its famous automatic markdown system, would eventually close altogether. Entire blocks of the South End and Roxbury went vacant. Arson became so common in some neighborhoods that residents kept bags packed by the door. The city felt, for a while, like it was contracting, folding inward, exhausted by its own convulsions. A place people used to live, past tense. But Boston had one asset that most declining American cities didn't: its universities and hospitals. Harvard and MIT sat just across the river in Cambridge. Boston University and Northeastern and Boston College ringed the city. Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's and Beth Israel anchored a medical corridor that employed tens of thousands. These institutions didn't leave because they couldn't leave. They were rooted in place, bound by endowments and real estate and a century of investment. When the national economy shifted toward knowledge and technology in the 1980s and 1990s, Boston was positioned to catch the wave. Route 128, the highway beltway around the city, became America's first technology corridor, lined with defense contractors, and then computer companies, and then biotech firms. The city began to grow again. New money arrived. Not Brahman money, not Curley money, but venture capital and research grants and hospital revenue. And in 1991, Boston began the most expensive act of civic self-correction in American history. The Big Dig, officially the Central Artery Tunnel Project, proposed to bury the elevated highway underground, replacing it with a tunnel, and to extend the Massachusetts Turnpike through a new tunnel beneath Boston Harbor to Logan Airport. When planning began in 1982, the original estimate was $2.8 billion. Construction started in 1991. It was the largest, most complex urban highway project ever attempted in the United States. 7.8 miles of new road, almost half of it underground, bored and blasted through the heart of a city that was still living and working and driving above. Workers relocated 29 miles of underground utility lines, some dating to the 19th century. They excavated beneath active railroad tracks through unstable soils. They built the widest cable-stayed bridge in the world. They did all of this while keeping the old elevated highway and downtown traffic running above them, a feat compared, without exaggeration, to performing open-heart surgery on a patient who's running a marathon. By the time the project was completed in December 2007, the final cost had ballooned to $14.8 billion, and when interest on the bonds was included, the full price exceeded $24 billion. It was plagued by cost overruns, vendor fraud, design flaws, and a ceiling collapse in one of the connector tunnels in July 2006 that killed a motorist beneath 12 tons of fallen concrete. The state was paying more than $100 million a year in debt service and would continue until 2038. But the Big Dig did what it set out to do. The elevated highway was demolished. 29 acres of land were freed, the same acreage almost exactly as the West End that had been demolished 4 decades earlier. In its place went the Rose Kennedy Greenway, a ribbon of parks stretching through downtown. The waterfront, for the first time in half a century, was reconnected to the city. You could walk from Faneuil Hall, the cradle of liberty where Samuel Adams had rallied the colonists, straight to the harbor without ducking under a highway. The drive through downtown dropped from 19 minutes to under 3. Carbon monoxide emissions in central Boston fell by 12%. The city spent $24 billion to undo the damage of a highway it had spent $110 million to build. Today, Boston's harbor is clean enough to swim in. The waterfront is lined with hotels and condominiums and restaurants where old piers once rotted. The Seaport District, built on landfill, because of course it was, has become one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country. The median home price in Boston is among the highest in America. The universities and hospitals that saved the city now dominate it so thoroughly that some longtime residents can barely afford to live in the neighborhoods where they grew up. The old Curley mansion on the Jamaica Way, with its shamrock shutters and marble fireplaces, is used by the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. Faneuil Hall is a shopping mall. The original tunnels of the 1897 subway still carry passengers beneath Tremont Street 129 years after they opened, though the system itself is notorious for breakdowns and delays. The West End is luxury high-rises and parking structures. If you stand there and try to imagine the narrow streets and the corner delis and the synagogues, there is nothing left to help you. The old neighborhood was not renovated or repurposed or adapted. It was erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. A museum a few blocks away preserves photographs and memories. The former residents held reunions for decades. Many of them are gone now. Boston is still a city of rebellion, though the rebellion looks different than it used to. It rebels against the cost of its own success, the rents that push out the working-class families whose grandparents built the neighborhoods, the traffic that still chokes its colonial-era streets, the tension between the institutions that generate wealth and the communities that absorb the consequences. The Zakim-Bunker Hill Bridge, the cable-stayed span built as part of the Big Dig, rises over the Charles River with towers designed to evoke the Bunker Hill Monument in Charlestown, where American colonists had stood their ground against the British Army in June of 1775. The bridge connects the old city to the new one. Its cables, the designers said, suggest a ship in full sail, a reference to the harbor, to the beginning of everything. The harbor is where Boston started 4 centuries ago, when a small group of English dissenters chose a defensible peninsula and called it a city upon a hill. They filled in the harbor to make room. They cut down the hill to fill in the harbor. They built the grandest hotel in America and then demolished it. They built neighborhoods and then demolished those. They built a highway that walled them off from the water that had given them everything. And then they spent a generation and $24 billion tearing the wall down. The water is still there. The city is still there. The restlessness, that old, expensive, magnificent, destructive restlessness, hasn't gone anywhere. Griffin's Wharf, where the tea was destroyed, was filled in and built over sometime in the early 19th century. The exact site is now under a commercial building, several hundred feet inland from the current water line. There is nothing to see. The land itself is new.